Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Office Hours. I'm Stuart Newsome, and today we're talking about if the future of RCM is finally catching up. And I'm excited to be joined by Monte Sandler, who's the Chief Operating Officer at WebPT. So, Monty, how you doing today?
I'm great, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, awesome. Why don't you just take a moment, kind of tell us yourself, and also tell us about WebPT for anybody who doesn't know. They should know, but if anybody doesn't know.
Um, so about myself, so I'm a CPA by background, and I have been in the rev cycle business for the past 30 years. I'm afraid to say, but been around for a long time, and I would say for the past 18 years, I've been part of uh, EMR software businesses. So building, running, managing rev cycle businesses within EMR companies. And so WebPT is a specialty EMR in the rehab therapy space. So physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and purpose-built EMR for rehab therapy and the product set. I think of it as an operating system for physical therapists. Everything from scheduling and intake through clinical documentation, and billing and collections. And as part of our service offering, we offer outsourced revenue cycle services as part of our solution set.
Nice, nice. Well, really thrilled to have you here, especially on this subject, because and 30 years is not so bad. I've been around them at the same time. So I
But
guess we
you have
got
a lot
two.
more hair than I do.
I don't know how that happened because I've been pulling out a lot. Uh, but now, as the title indicates, you may be asking yourselves, really talking to the audience now, but what does he mean when he says RCM is finally catching up? And if you work in RCM, especially the boots on the ground, then right? But healthcare revenue cycle is, like I like to call it, the payment maze of healthcare. It's complex. It's highly regulated. It's slow to change. It's also full of ambiguity between what was done, what was documented, what was billed, and ultimately what gets paid. Because at the end of the day, it's all about getting paid. So today we're going to talk about that, about why that maze has been so hard to modernize, whether AI can finally help revenue cycle teams navigate it more intelligently. As always, I want to remind everyone we do have a Q&A at the end. So please put in your questions in the Q&A box here in Zoom. Also, welcome comments. If you have any insightful comments about the subject that we're talking about, we'd like to read those out loud if we have time to do at the end. We'll try and make time at the end to address any questions that you have. So please jot those in the box as we move along. So, Monty, you ready to roll?
Ready?
All
Let's
right.
do it.
First, I want to start pretty broadly, um, and and that is healthcare is one of the few industries where revenue cycle has become its own discipline, so to speak. Um, why do you think healthcare became so different from other industries?
Yeah, it's interesting. As a CPA, I was an auditor early in my career, and went around to lots of different businesses and industries, manufacturing, service. And the reality is, every industry, every business has a revenue cycle, right? Uh, but healthcare is the only industry where we've actually really named it, and we talk about it as its own discipline, as you mentioned. And, why is that? Well, in every other industry, you know, you buy a product or you buy a service and there's a published fee schedule and they send you an invoice and you pay it, right? And so you may have some AR clerks that help manage the process, but by and large, especially in today's world, every other revenue cycle is pretty simple. It's highly automated, and it works. Healthcare, we've created something dramatically different. I think it largely starts with our reimbursement model in healthcare. And, when you think about it, there's roughly 1,200 payers across the country. There's 11,000 CPT codes. There are 75,000 diagnosis codes. There are 350 different modifiers. Okay, just those things alone. And by the way, there's lots of other things that go into claims
Oh yeah.
processing. Okay, but just those things alone, you think about how complicated our reimbursement system is. That's 346 trillion mathematical computations of way things are billed and paid, right, in healthcare. Now, not all of those match because not everything works together, right? But you understand, right, the complexity that we've created and the variables that go into getting a claim billed and paid. And look, that doesn't even consider contracts and fee schedules and prior auths and national correct coding initiatives and right, like I mean, it goes on, right? And
Yep.
so the reality is that we have created in healthcare, a revenue cycle that is infinitely more complicated than any other industry that I know of. And you know, I would say, until kind of this latest generation, which we're going to talk about of AI, um, you know, it's really hard to automate all of those complexities. And so I think, that is why, we've created this system and why, in a lot of ways, it's decades behind other industries.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And part of that problem also, and what is the remedy that's been tried, to handle it in the past? And it's done, I guess, a fair job, maybe in some instances, depends. But I'm talking about those rules engines, those decision trees, you know, been using those like for decades now, like you mentioned a few variables,
Yeah.
payer rules, plan rules, CPT codes, ICD-10 codes, modifiers, authorizations, documentation requirements. We didn't even talk about E&M codes, right? E&M coding and how that plays an impact. All leads to denials. So let's talk about those decision trees. What makes those decision trees so difficult to automate in a reliable way?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, 30 years ago, in order to scale a revenue cycle operation, um, we had to train a lot of people. We had to manage a lot of people, right? And in order to do that with any consistency, we really had to build decision trees for everything that we do. And the reason that there's so many decision trees and the reason those are so complicated is because of all those permutations around, the numbers that I shared before. Um, and um, and so, way back then it was okay, well, let's build the decision trees. Let's use that to train all of our people. And, that's how we can deliver services in a repeatable, high quality way. And I would say that over the last 30 years, we've inched our way along as technology has become available to try to find ways to improve upon that. Um, you know, so for example, we have electronic transaction code sets today that didn't exist before, and so we're able to send claims out and receive payments back in a standard uniform way with consistent data that gives us good kind of information and feedback around what I would call root cause, so that we can then tailor the way that we handle transactions. We can look for trends. We can, right, try to move upstream to better deliver rev cycle performance. We have RPA would be another kind of area that has been introduced over the decades. And RPA is great, but it's very binary, right? So I use robotic process automation. I, program, different rule sets or different functions. And, that's what the technology goes and transacts on. If something changes, that bot breaks, right? And so I have to be really kind of narrow in my scope. I have to be really rigorous in, exactly what steps the bot is taking, and I also have to be on top of the management of it because they break all the time. And so, from my perspective, we've cobbled together lots of ways to, get better, be more efficient, and but we're nipping at the edges, right?
Hmm.
And look, we've made a lot of progress, over the 30 years that I've been doing this. But it's still, highly manual, and we're still dependent on people and decision trees, and especially when we talk about scaling rev cycle operations. So those are some of the things that we've tried to do over time, and but they all have limitations.
Right, exactly. So and you've mentioned, and I've experienced those limitations firsthand, I can tell you. So but I've also seen some success. They still have a place in the world of RCM. But you've mentioned, automation is binary. Um, and that it works when the rule is clear. The format stays the same, but when something changes, the work often ends up back with a person or broken. Now you have more work,
Yeah.
right? You have to go and course correct either the RPA or the rule itself or the edit. Um, what makes AI different in how it can support revenue cycle work?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, I will tell you that even back 30 years ago when we were creating these decision trees for everything that we do in RevCycle, there was always a belief that there will be a day that we can automate this work. All these other industries are doing it, we will at some point in time. And we've again inched our way there, over time, and we've nipped at the edges of it, and there's a lot we've accomplished. But from my perspective, um, AI is really kind of the technology, the solution that is going to really unlock this potential, unlike anything that we have been able to experience yet. Um, and I would say in large part and in very simple terms, those other solutions are very binary, they're rules focused, right? Like, all the things we just talked about.
Hmm.
AI is very dynamic, right? It can handle large data sets, and it actually thrives on those complexities, right? And so because it's dynamic, and can handle the variability, it really kind of thrives where all of the legacy technology breaks down. It recognizes patterns, it can handle structured and unstructured data. It does probabilistic reasoning, right? And so all these things that, we just have not had the ability to do in the past, AI now kind of unlocks that and opens the door for what I believe this industry to move closer to all the other industries out there and
Hmm.
really start to automate a lot more of what we're doing and handle the complexity of the 346 trillion combinations.
Right, because it can do some mundane task. It can, and it may leverage automation because AI can actually be set up where it can either help with RPA, it can help with automation. It can determine, hey, this an HL7 interface. We're going to push it that way. There's explainable AI coming out now. We've all familiar with generic AI. We're all familiar with agentic AI. It's kind of now hit the scene in the last year or so, and then but now there's explainable, AI. So it's always these versions of AI, with machine learning models, and it's really going to be more dynamic, way beyond any rules engine, decision tree, or RPA, for sure. But I will say, when I speak with a lot of clients, prospects, whether it be at a trade show, a conference, wherever, a lot of revenue cycle leaders are skeptical right now. Honestly, they think they have a reason, and I really think they have a reason to be. Many organizations have spent a lot of money on automation and AI tools that didn't deliver what was promised. So when leaders are evaluating AI today, what should they look for to separate meaningful AI from what I'm going to call the hype?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question, and you said it correctly. I mean, the technology is moving so fast, and you know, uh, not just in healthcare, right? Just in our society as a whole. Things are moving fast and changing, and new capabilities are coming to light all the time. And so I'm not sure there's a perfect answer to your question. Um, what I would say to you is, I've seen enough and I'm doing enough today to be convinced that this is the technology that is going to unlock, transformational automation in healthcare rev cycle. I think what I would recommend that leaders do more than anything is to educate themselves.
Mhm.
Right? I think, um, you know, there's a lot out there. So how do you best educate yourself, learn what capabilities exist? I'm a big believer of, kind of playing the hand that you're dealt. There's in a perfect world, I could design and come up with, exactly what I would like to be able to do. But that's not always possible because we don't live in a perfect world, right?
Right.
And so in a lot of ways, I think that there's this progression of easing your way into it. I think it starts with education, right? How do you start talking to people? How do you start researching and understand what's out there and what capabilities exist? And then you really have to start thinking about how do they fit into the world that I live in today, right? Um, you know, I do believe that, over the next decade, all of these technologies are going to have to be rewritten, right? These legacy platforms.
Yeah.
Because I fundamentally, there's a lot of people that are bolting AI solutions on to legacy tech right now. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that that's going to unlock a bunch of potential and capability, but it's going to have a ceiling, right? Because if the underlying legacy technology, can't scale with the bolt-on AI, I think ultimately that's going to have limitations, right? And so I do believe that over the course of the next decade, we're going to see most of these applications being completely rewritten in an AI native fashion, that will, significantly raise the ceiling of what's possible. But not everybody can do that on day one, right? And so I think educating yourself, understanding kind of the hand that you've been dealt, and then looking for things that you could start to test or introduce into your process, into your technology stack, to start to take advantage of a lot of these automation capabilities, I think is kind of a logical way to approach it. Um, I think it's going to be hard, right? Just like what I've seen over the last 30 years, like RCM is such a broad term, right? You think about like when somebody says they're in the RCM business, I mean, that could mean they could be in full rev cycle. That could mean that they just do a very specific niche part of rev cycle and kind of everything in between, right? And I think we're going to find the same thing with AI, right? Like all of a sudden everybody's got AI, right? Well, is that really true? Well, probably not, right? And there's going to be a certain amount of work that everybody's going to have to do to make sure, okay, what really is AI versus this is just a glorified rules engine, or right, or this is really just glorified RPA. And so I think it all comes back to me to education, right?
Mhm.
How do we as leaders really educate ourselves, ask the probing questions to make sure that you understand what capabilities exist and what am I actually buying?
Exactly, exactly. And you make a great point. Education is key because on top of skepticism, if it's not skepticism, it's just the opposite. Because I just, spoke with a provider the other day and he was thinking AI would perform a certain function, and I kept saying that's not exactly how that's going to work. I walked him through it and he's like, "No, AI is going to do everything." I went, "Okay, this is where we need to go back to square one. All right. We're going to go back and learn our ABCs again." But that's the perception. And it's like you have both sides of the spectrum and everybody that kind of falls in the middle there, where those who think, "Oh yeah, AI is going to do it all. It can do it all." What do you mean it can't do it all? And then the other side is very skeptic. So I think that's very telling, for sure. So really bringing this into, say, a more specially specific type of a question here, since with WebPT, has such a strong presence in the therapy space. Um, for PT, OT, perhaps rehab therapy practices, where eligibility, especially re-verification that happens every year, like the holidays, it comes every year at the same time, but everyone's so surprised. There's documentation, payer rules, but they can all create a lot of friction. Where do you see the most practical opportunities for AI-enabled improvement, particularly and especially that you're in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, so, it's interesting. Sometimes the biggest benefits are found in the smallest of things, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, our data tells us that 67% of the exceptions, so rejections, denials, right, those sorts of things, um, come from mistakes made on the front end of the revenue cycle in our specialty.
Hmm.
Eligibility verification, registration errors, prior authorization. Um, and uh, so I think those are prime opportunities for us to find solutions leveraging AI to help um, our members um, get it right the first time so that we can eliminate all of those exceptions on the back end and really turn visits into cash much faster.
Hmm.
For all of us rev cycle people, it's the exceptions that, the rejections, the denials, the stale AR, right? Those are the things that make our world so complicated,
Right,
right?
right.
And so finding ways to really understand the root cause of those exceptions and then deploy solutions to solve them. So, look, it's no surprise that the intake role at most clinics is the lowest paid, highest turnover role in the whole rev cycle, right? Arguably, they have the most important job because if they don't register a patient right, if they don't check eligibility correctly, if they get those things wrong, don't get prior authorization, then you know we're going to end up with claim exceptions, denials, rejections, et cetera. And so, so we're spending time looking at that in particular, right? And how can we leverage AI in a way that helps our users get those things right the first time, uh, so that we can improve um, the flow of claims and turning visits to cash. Another area, and I think people are probably starting to dip their toe because we're seeing a lot more of it is, scribe functionality, right? That leverages AI agents to listen to providers during the treatment and help the documentation. There's a lot of capabilities that AI can then deploy to make sure the provider covers everything that they should be covering in that visit, making sure that everything that gets, done in the visit gets captured in the notes and gets coded appropriately with ICD and CPT codes, modifiers, et cetera. And so that's another area where we see AI being very opportunistic. And then on the back end of the rev cycle, there's lots of areas too, right? I mean, payment posting in particular, certainly managing exceptions of rejections and denials and following up on unpaid AR. Look, there's AI solutions for patient interaction and call center. There are steps in across the entire flow that we now have AI technology that can help shape automation and automate this cycle that has been extremely manual for a long time.
Right. Yeah. And it's much needed for sure. Much needed for sure. And yeah, I think going back to your comments about the legacy systems with EHRs, it's gonna take more than going to to the vendor and saying, hey, what can you do? Because it's the lowest common denominator, and I almost want to say, and I have said this before, it says, look, the 90s called and they want their user interface back, you know. So you have to build some kind of architecture around that infrastructure that's over 30, 35, 40 years old in some instances.
Yeah.
And it's just, who does that? Everybody else is now moved forward, So it's interesting. I just wanted to circle back on that. Well, that's all the questions I have right now, Monty. I'm going to look at some Q&A now and see if we have any questions from the audience. We do have one here, actually two. Uh, I think we can spare a few minutes to get to both of them. What parts of the revenue cycle should remain human-led even as AI becomes more capable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? And your example of your conversation with the provider was telling. To think that we're going to go from this state that we're in today and be, completely automated, hands off, just watching lights on a server blink, is pretty unrealistic, right? And
Mhm.
so I think, we're on a path that is going to take time. I think the way that I always think about this is this concept of uh, that I want everybody to work at the top of their pay grade. So, when I say that to people,
Right.
they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, what I mean is, um, you know, we pay everybody a salary or an hourly rate that represents kind of the top tier of what their skill set is and right, what we expect of them. The reality is that the tasks and the job and the work that they're doing every day, a lot of it is well below that level, right? So if you think about a biller, for example, there's a lot of just data entry that billers are doing, but yet we're paying them, to be analytical and thought provoking and right, like at their kind of hourly rate. And so my goal is always like, how do I leverage this technology so that I can take the lower level work off of those people and help them work at the top of their pay grade so that they are, as effective and efficient as they can be and, is exactly what I'm paying them for. And so I think about AI in that same way. Like I think that AI is going to help us start to remove a lot of the transactional work, right? A lot of the a lot of that kind of rote work, and we're gonna allow a lot of our people to transform themselves into doing the higher level work, right? The more analytical work, the more strategic work, you know, you know, if you've used ChatGPT or Claude, right, you know that AI is in a lot of ways only as good as the prompts that you are giving it,
Right.
asking it, right? And so we're going to need people that are asking the right questions, that are prompting the right things, that are, pointing the AI in the right direction and keeping it on the rails, right?
Right.
Compliance would be another area, right? So that's kind of the way that I think about, this kind of next phase of rev cycle and all of the automation we're gonna deploy.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. I'm going to squeeze this last question in.
Okay.
So, what is one warning sign that an AI solution may really just be a rules engine with better marketing?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to my point about, everything, all of a sudden everybody has AI, right? Well, I highly doubt that, right? And so, um, look, I think a lot of this comes back to the education, making sure that you're an educated consumer, educated user. I also, I think of this in terms of, rules engines and RPA are very binary. They're
Hmm.
very if then they break, right?
Yep.
They're not adaptable, and that is not AI, right?
Right.
AI, is much more dynamic. It can handle those solution sets. It can, help make decisions. It can handle those complexities. And so, in its simplest terms, binary versus dynamic, and make sure you understand the difference because I think that's really how you're going to root out some of the stuff that isn't really AI.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Totally agree. Well, that's all the audience questions. And that's all the questions I have as well. Monty, I want to thank you for joining us and taking your time out of your busy schedule to be with us and talk about this critical subject. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I hope to have you again.
I would love it. Thanks for having me, and have a great day.
Yeah, yeah. And everyone else who joined us, we appreciate you being on with us and taking the time out of your schedule as well. Be sure, to join us next week for our next episode of Office Hours. It's always every Thursday around 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. And you can also visit our website, infinix.com. We have a lot of articles, case studies, and even solutions for everything under the sun of RCM. So until then, we'll see you next time.